The Mongol Empire did not fall to a rival army. No foreign king brought it down. No siege engine cracked its walls. The greatest war machine in human history, the force that turned entire cities to ash and made emperors beg, was destroyed from the inside. And the weapon that killed it was the same bloodline that built it. 7 Khans, 7 deaths. None of them died the way a conqueror should die. And once the pattern becomes clear, once the method behind each death comes into focus, what the Mongol Empire actually was becomes something far stranger than any history textbook ever admitted. Start with the man who started everything. The man who, by the time he was 40, had killed more human beings than the Black Death would kill a century later. Genghis Khan, the ghost of the steppe. Born into slavery, he died as the ruler of the largest empire ever assembled in a single lifetime. The year is 1227. Genghis is marching against the Western Xia, a campaign of punishment, the last one he would ever lead. He was somewhere between 60 and 70 years old, which by Mongol standards was an almost supernatural age for a man who had spent his entire adult life at war. His body had taken everything the steppe could throw at it. Then something happened. The Mongol records go deliberately quiet. Not quiet the way records go quiet when nothing important occurred. Quiet the way powerful men go quiet when something has gone terribly wrong, and they do not want the world to know it yet. His death was hidden from his own army for weeks. The question is, why? Some said he fell from his horse. Marco Polo, writing decades later, claimed a poisoned arrow. There were whispers, persistent ones, of a captured Tangut princess who carried a hidden blade. Each story had the shape of a death worthy of Genghis Khan. Violent, dramatic. A warrior brought down by a warrior's death. But modern forensic historians have examined the region, the season, the campaign conditions, and the symptoms described in the few surviving accounts. What they found was not a battle wound. It was not an assassin. The thing that killed the most feared man alive was something that made no noise, carried no sword, and did not care in the slightest who he was. Bubonic plague, endemic to the region, carried by the same rodent populations that blanket the Central Asian steppe. The man who reshaped the world was likely killed by a flea. His body was carried back in secret, and the soldiers who transported it killed every living thing they passed. To protect the secret, or perhaps because they could not accept what had actually happened. His son inherited everything. Ogedei Khan, the second great Khan, was, by most accounts, a more functional administrator than his father. Where Genghis built an empire through terror, Ogedei built it into something that actually worked. He constructed roads, established a postal system, and organized the first Mongol bureaucracy. He also drank. Not the way a man drinks after a long campaign, not the way a king drinks at a banquet. Ogedei drank the way a man drinks when drinking has become the architecture of his life, constant, structural, and invisible to him because it had become identical to breathing. His court knew, his generals knew, his own brother, Chagatai, was alarmed enough to act. Chagatai appointed a personal minder, an official whose only job was to follow Ogedei and count his cups. A formal intervention embedded in the structure of the empire. Ogedei accepted this restriction with apparent grace. He nodded. He agreed. He was a reasonable man. Then he commissioned new drinking cups, 3 times the size of any cup previously used at court. While Ogedei's army stood at the gates of Vienna in 1241, the furthest west the Mongols would ever reach, something happened to the man sending those armies. Europe did not know it yet, but the existential threat to Western civilization was not being resolved on a battlefield. It was being resolved in a palace in Karakorum, around a table in the middle of the night. December 11th, 1241. Following a drinking session that lasted through the night, Ogedei Khan was dead. His commanders, legally required to halt all military campaigns and return to elect a new great Khan, turned their horses away from Vienna. Western Europe was saved, not by a crusade, not by a miracle, not by the courage of any king, by a drinking binge. The next Khan to hold genuine authority over the entire unified empire was Monkey. He was different from his predecessors in one critical way. He was competent, disciplined, and, by Mongol standards, temperate. He had none of his uncle's fatal weakness. He was the kind of ruler who understood that an empire required more than conquest. It required management.
In 1259, Mongke was overseeing a siege at Diaoyu Fortress in Sichuan, China. The campaign was brutal, not because of any particular enemy innovation, but because of the environment itself. Sichuan in summer is a specific kind of misery. Wet heat, dense terrain, and water sources compromised by thousands of men and horses living and dying along the same riverbanks. Some Chinese chronicles record a missile wound, a bolt or arrow that struck him during the assault. It is a clean story, a warrior story. But the majority of serious historians look past it and instead look at what the siege conditions were actually producing in the Mongol camp during those months. They look at what the water was carrying. Dysentery, the last Khan to rule a unified Mongol Empire, likely died from contaminated water, a disease of failed sanitation, of armies too large for the land they occupied. His death cracked the empire in half. His brothers, Kublai and Arik Boke, immediately went to war over succession. The unified empire would never exist again. It died with Mongke's digestive system. Kublai Khan won that civil war and went further than any of his predecessors. He founded the Yuan dynasty, absorbed China, and governed more people from a single throne than any ruler before him. Marco Polo visited his court and returned to Venice with stories no one believed. The man at the center of those stories was, by then, beginning to come apart. His favorite wife, Shabi, the woman who had been his most trusted advisor for decades, died. Then his chosen heir, Prince Genghis, died before him. Kublai had outlived the two people who had oriented his life. What followed was not mourning in the way courts perform mourning. It was something slower, a withdrawal into the palace, into the body, into consumption. He ate, he drank, he stopped moving. The man who had once ridden across half a continent became a figure who rarely left his chambers. His physicians noted the swelling in his joints, the labored movement, the deteriorating condition of a body that had once been an instrument of war and was now something else entirely. Kublai Khan died in 1294, obese and largely immobile, from the compounded effects of chronic gout and alcoholism. The ruler of the largest empire ever governed by a single man spent his final years unable to walk without pain, eating and drinking himself toward an exit that took years to fully arrive. The empire he left behind fragmented within a generation. Tamerlane was not technically a Mongol by blood. He was Turkic, but he claimed descent from Genghis Khan through his wife. He modeled his conquests on Mongol strategy, and he was, in terms of pure destruction per year of campaigning, the closest thing the 14th century produced to the original. 17 million dead, towers built from human skulls, cities erased from the map. In the winter of 1404, Tamerlane was 68 years old. Most men who had lived the life he had lived were long dead. His body carried decades of wounds, a lame leg, a partially paralyzed arm, the physical record of a life spent in violent motion. None of this stopped him. He assembled an army and set out to conquer China. He made it as far as Otrar in what is now Kazakhstan before the winter caught him. The temperatures dropped to levels that killed horses outright. His army was struggling. And then Tamerlane himself fell ill, a severe climbing fever that his physicians recognized immediately as dangerous and acted upon with everything their medical tradition offered. His doctors were not incompetent men. They were the most qualified physicians available to the most powerful ruler in the world. They assessed the fever, they considered the options, and they chose a treatment that was, by the medical logic of their time, entirely rational. It was also, in the specific situation they were in, the worst possible decision anyone could have made. They packed his body in ice, in sub-zero temperatures, in a winter that was already killing his horses. The treatment was designed to break the fever, and it did. It also sent his already stressed cardiovascular system into immediate collapse. Tamerlane, the man who had depopulated entire regions of Asia, was killed by his own doctors trying to save him, in a cold that was already killing everything around him. Janabeg Khan of the Golden Horde has a specific historical distinction that sets him apart from every other ruler on this list. He is the only leader in recorded history known to have deliberately weaponized a pandemic. In 1346, while besieging the Crimean trading port of Kaffa, his army was struck by the Black Death. Janabeg did not retreat. He adapted. The infected corpses of his soldiers were loaded into siege engines and catapulted over the city walls of Kaffa. The plague spread inside the city. The Genoese merchants who fled carried it back to their ships, to their ports, to Italy, to France. The chain that would eventually kill a third of Europe's population begins, by most historical accounts, with Janibeg's decision to turn his own dead into ammunition.
He survived the plague. He survived the campaign. By any military logic, he had won. The question is how the man who had unleashed the Black Death on the world actually died. Because it was not disease, and it was not an enemy army, and it was not anything the history books describe as a fitting end for a man of his particular brutality.
Janibeg Khan was murdered in his bed. His own son, Berdebeg, decided that waiting for his father to die naturally was taking too long. He had Janibeg killed, took the throne, and then, consistent with the logic of Mongol succession, immediately killed his 12 brothers to eliminate any competing claims. The man who turned plague into a weapon was taken out by the oldest weapon in history, a son who wanted what his father had.
Abaka Khan of the Ilkhanate was one of the more strategically sophisticated rulers in this entire bloodline. He understood diplomacy. He cultivated alliances with Christian powers in Europe, attempting to build a coalition against the Mamluk Sultanate, the one military force that had consistently stopped Mongol expansion cold. He was a man who thought beyond the battle in front of him.
He was also a man who drank heavily. This was not unusual among Mongol rulers. The pattern should be clear by now. But what made Abaka's case distinct was not the drinking itself. It was what happened in the final days of his life, when his condition deteriorated rapidly, and his body began doing things that no wound, no poison, and no disease could fully explain.
He experienced violent hallucinations. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He went through cycles of sweating and convulsion that his physicians could not attribute to any fever or infection they recognized. The symptoms were terrifying to witness and, at the time, medically inexplicable. His court watched and waited. He died in 1282, and the official cause was left vague. Modern analysis points to delirium tremens, the syndrome that occurs when a severe, long-term alcoholic stops drinking suddenly. The cardiovascular strain alone can be fatal. The hallucinations, the tremors, the convulsions, these are its signature. Abaka Khan, one of the most strategically capable rulers in Mongol history, likely died because his body had become so dependent on alcohol that being without it killed him faster than any enemy could have.
7 Khans. The pattern is not subtle once it is laid out plainly. Plague, alcohol, disease from contaminated water, gout compounded by alcohol, medical malpractice in a blizzard, a son with a knife, alcohol withdrawal. The Mongol Empire, the entity that conquered more territory in less time than any force in human history, was not brought down by anything it fought.
It was brought down by biology, by the specific vulnerabilities of the bodies that carried it, by the drinking culture that ran through the Mongol ruling class like a structural flaw in a foundation, by the succession crises that turned sons against fathers and brothers against brothers, by the simple fact that the men who built the most violent empire in history were, in the end, men.
No army defeated Genghis Khan. No rebellion toppled Ogadai. No rival general outmaneuvered Mongke. What stopped them was what stops everything eventually: the body's refusal to continue. The difference is that in the Mongol case, those bodies were carrying half the known world with them when they finally gave out. And when they did, the world they had built gave out with them.